Captain Ibrahim Traoré had always been different. He wasn't born into power or wealth, but he had something that could never be bought: skills, determination, and a deep sense of justice. His rise in the military was nothing short of extraordinary. He started out as a young officer with a passion for serving his country, but over time, he became more than just another soldier. People began to take notice of him, not only his fellow officers, but also the common people who admired his honesty and leadership. Burkina Faso was a country facing many challenges. There was constant political instability, a struggling economy, and ongoing conflicts with extremist groups that made everyday life harder for the citizens. Despite these problems, Traoré remained focused on what he believed was the most important: protecting the people and restoring peace to his country. He quickly earned the trust of his troops. Under his command, they fought with an unmatched level of unity and discipline. His decisions on the battlefield were smart and calculated, and his ability to lead during tough times made him a hero to many. When he spoke, people listened, not because of his rank, but because they believed in him. However, his growing influence began to worry others in the military. Senior officers, especially those with political ties, began to see him as a threat. They weren't used to someone like Traoré, an officer who spoke his mind, questioned authority, and acted with integrity. They preferred officers who followed orders without asking questions, and this made them nervous. Power in the military wasn't just about strength, it was about loyalty to the system. And Traoré had shown that his loyalty lay not with the system, but with the people. Captain Traoré's reputation for being honest and brave made him extremely popular with the younger officers and soldiers. They admired his calm demeanor under pressure and the way he always put his soldiers' well-being above all else. But with that popularity came trouble. Some of the more senior officers began to worry that his rising star might overshadow their own positions. After all, if the soldiers liked him more than they liked their commanders, the balance of power could shift. This led to secret meetings and whispers behind closed doors. Some officers saw Traoré's popularity as a threat to the military's chain of command, and they began to discuss ways to handle the situation. The problem was that they didn't know how to control him without making him look like a target. If they threatened him or undermined him directly, it could backfire, especially with how much support he had from the troops. But Captain Traoré wasn't the type to be easily intimidated. He had always followed his instincts, and that's what made him stand out. His courage and sense of right and wrong made him fearless in the face of danger. He wasn't going to be silenced by the political games of his superiors, but he knew the risks. He knew that with his rise came inevitable challenges. The question was, how long could he keep his position without running into trouble with those who felt threatened by his growing influence? As the country's situation became more dire, it became clear that the struggle for power within the military was only just beginning. Traoré was about to face forces much greater than anything he had ever encountered. The coming storm would test not only his leadership but also his resolve to protect the people he had promised to serve. And so, with every victory, every battle won, and every praise he received, Captain Traoré began to realize that the more people he inspired, the more enemies he would make, and the price of leadership, it seemed, was higher than he ever imagined. Colonel Bemba Kaboré had been in the military for decades. He was a man of many connections, known for his loyalty to those who could give him more power. The country's politics were complicated, and Kaboré had learned early on that the way to stay ahead was by making the right friends and keeping your enemies close. In his world, loyalty wasn't just about doing the right thing, it was about playing the game. As Captain Ibrahim Traoré continued to rise in popularity, Kaboré began to see him as more than just a talented officer. He saw a threat. Traoré wasn't just a skilled leader, he was someone the soldiers looked up to, someone the people respected. If that wasn't controlled, it could lead to serious problems. Kaboré, with his years of experience, understood how easily power could slip away. The fear that his own influence might be challenged began to grow in him. One evening, Kaboré decided it was time to meet with Traoré. It wasn't an official meeting. It wasn't meant to be. He called for a private conversation under the pretense of discussing military strategy. But deep down, Kaboré knew it was more than that. It was his chance to remind Traoré where his loyalty should lie. The meeting took place in a quiet, secure room inside the military base. It was just the two of them, surrounded by the heavy silence of the room. Traoré entered, confident and composed, unaware of the storm brewing around him. He greeted Cabaret with respect, his face calm, showing none of the tension he might have been feeling. Cabaret, on the other hand, didn't smile. His eyes, sharp and calculating, studied Traoré closely. "Captain," Cabaret began, his voice low but firm, "you've done well in the field. The soldiers trust you, and your victories have made a mark. But you need to understand that loyalty to the chain of command is not optional." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "The country is at a tipping point. There's no room for personal ambitions, especially not in times like these." Traoré listened quietly. He wasn't one to interrupt, especially in a conversation like this. But inside, he was processing Cabaret's words carefully. He could tell this wasn't just about military strategy. Cabaret wasn't speaking as a senior officer. He was speaking as a man trying to control something bigger than a battlefield. "I understand, sir," Traoré replied calmly, "but my loyalty lies with the people of this country. I believe in serving them, not just following orders without question." Cabaret's expression darkened. The words weren't exactly what he had wanted to hear. He had hoped to bend Traoré's will, to remind him of his place in the grand scheme of things. Instead, he heard a defiant answer. This was the moment that Cabaret realized that keeping Traoré in check might not be as easy as he had hoped. "You don't seem to understand," Cabaret said, his voice growing colder. "Loyalty to the system is what keeps everything running. Step out of line, and you will regret it." He leaned in closer, his tone more threatening now. "Remember, you are nothing without the military. You're nothing without the chain of command. And if you keep ignoring that, the consequences will be severe." Traoré met his gaze steadily. The air between them crackled with tension. It was clear to him that Cabaret wasn't just offering advice. He was issuing a warning. But Traoré wasn't one to be easily intimidated. He didn't respond to threats, not even from a man like Cabaret. "I'll do what's right, sir," Traoré said simply, standing his ground. Cabaret watched him for a moment, his mind racing. He didn't want to back down, but neither did he want to escalate things too quickly. The power struggle between them had only just begun, but the next move, Cabaret knew, could change everything. And that was a risk he was willing to take. As the meeting ended and Traoré left the room, Cabaret couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. He had tried to control the situation, to put Traoré in his place, but something told him that this battle for power wasn't going to be easily won. In fact, it had only just begun. The next few days were filled with tension. Captain Ibrahim Traoré could feel the weight of the conversation with Colonel Cabaret lingering over him. He knew that things weren't going to stay calm for long. The military and political environment in Burkina Faso were becoming more unstable by the day. But what concerned him most was the subtle threat Cabaret had issued. It was clear now, Cabaret wasn't just a senior officer trying to keep order. He was a man determined to hold on to his power at any cost. Traoré wasn't a fool. He understood the delicate balance of power in the military. Loyalty to the higher-ups was essential for survival in the ranks, but he couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. His duty was to the people, and he believed in fighting for them, not for the selfish interests of a few powerful men. However, he also knew that his position was becoming more dangerous by the hour. Cabaret's words echoed in his mind. Loyalty to the system is what keeps everything running. He couldn't just ignore that threat. He had to be careful. Yet Traoré's calm demeanor and dedication to his troops made him less likely to be intimidated. He wasn't afraid of Cabaret, but he understood the game that was being played. The colonel had power, and his influence ran deep within the military's leadership. If he wanted to stop Traoré, he would use that power. Meanwhile, Cabaret was not a man who liked to be ignored. The meeting they had was only the beginning of his attempts to bring Traoré into line. Cabaret's authority had always been unquestioned, but now he was faced with someone who seemed to challenge his control. This was something new for him. Instead of using his usual tactics of manipulation and pressure, he had to take a different approach. One evening, Cabaret arranged a second meeting with Traoré, this time under more formal circumstances. It was supposed to be a routine discussion about military strategy, but Cabaret had other plans. He needed to remind Traoré of who was in charge. The stakes were higher now, and he couldn't afford to lose control. When Traoré entered the room, Kabore was waiting for him, his face unreadable. The tension between the two men was palpable. This time, Kabore didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "Captain," Kabore began, his voice low but filled with authority, "I hope you understand the seriousness of the situation. What I said before was not a warning, it was a promise." Traoré remained silent, his eyes meeting Kabore's without fear. He had expected this. He had expected Kabore to try again, but he wasn't going to back down. "You have a responsibility," Kabore continued, "not just to your soldiers, but to this entire country. If you continue down this path of defiance, you will regret it." The words hung heavy in the air, but Traoré didn't flinch. He had made up his mind long ago that he would fight for what he believed in, no matter the consequences. "I won't be intimidated by threats," Traoré said, his voice calm but firm. "I will do what's right for the people of Burkina Faso." Kabore's face twisted with frustration. It was clear that Traoré wasn't going to be easily swayed, and that was exactly what worried Kabore. This wasn't just about military strategy anymore. It was about control, about who would shape the future of the country. Kabore leaned in closer, his tone darkening. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? But remember, no one is above the system, not even you." With that, Kabore stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. The conversation was over, but the tension was far from gone. As Traoré left the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to escalate from here. Kabore had made his threat clear, but now there was something even more dangerous at play. The colonel had crossed a line. He wasn't just trying to control Traoré's actions, he was trying to break him. Traoré knew the stakes had never been higher. If he wanted to protect the people and the principles he believed in, he would have to face the consequences head-on. The power struggle between him and Kabore was only just beginning, and the entire nation was about to feel the impact. Days after the tense meeting with Colonel Kabore, Captain Ibrahim Traoré began to notice small changes in his surroundings. Whispers filled the corridors of the military base, and his fellow officers seemed to avoid making direct eye contact. He could feel the pressure building, but he wasn't going to let it shake him. He had made his decision. He would not be intimidated, no matter the cost. But what Traoré didn't know was that the meeting with Kabore hadn't gone unnoticed. A few junior officers, loyal to Traoré and disturbed by the colonel's threatening behavior, had been present outside the room. They had seen the tension between the two men and heard the heated words through cracks in the door. Some of these officers felt an intense loyalty to Traoré, and they couldn't stand the idea of him being bullied into silence. They knew that what had happened behind closed doors was wrong, and it had to be exposed. They decided to take action. Without asking for anyone's permission, they secretly copied the footage from the BODYCAM that had been recording the entire exchange. It wasn't easy, and they knew they were taking a huge risk. Leaking such sensitive material could bring severe consequences, possibly even death, but they felt it was worth the risk. They couldn't let the truth be hidden, not when the future of the country and the safety of its people were at stake. Once the footage was secured, they found a way to leak it to the outside world. It wasn't long before the video began circulating on small online forums. It was rough and blurry, the quality not perfect, but the message was clear. In the video, Kabore's voice could be heard threatening Traoré, trying to break his will with intimidation. It wasn't just a military matter anymore, it was a public scandal. As soon as the video began to spread, it caught the attention of journalists, both local and international. News outlets from all over West Africa started picking up the story. Soon, the footage was on television, radio, and social media platforms. The country was in shock. People who had been following Traoré's rise in the military now saw the raw, unfiltered truth. He wasn't just a brave officer, he was someone who had been bullied by one of the most powerful figures in the military. Back at the military base, Kabore was furious. He immediately called for an investigation, demanding to know who had leaked the footage. His grip on power was slipping, and he could feel the walls closing in. This wasn't just a political issue anymore, it was a full-blown public crisis. The video had gone viral, and the whole country was watching. There was no turning back. The leak had set off a wave of protests across the capital, Ouagadougou. People flooded the streets, waving flags and chanting the name of Captain Traoré. They had watched the video, and they were outraged by Kaboré's actions. It wasn't just a military issue. It was about respect for the people, and now the people were demanding answers. The protests grew larger by the day. In every corner of the city, citizens gathered to show their support for Traoré, calling for justice and a change in leadership. But it wasn't just the civilians who were upset. Within the military itself, younger officers began questioning their loyalty to Kaboré. They were torn between following the old system and standing with the man who had shown them what true leadership looked like. Many of them, inspired by Traoré's courage and principles, began to side with him. Kaboré, now under immense pressure, attempted to downplay the situation. He called the leak a fabrication and accused Traoré of trying to undermine the military's unity. But no one was listening. The truth had been revealed, and it was too late to take it back. The video had done more than expose the colonel. It had sparked something much larger. It had shown the people of Burkina Faso the power of transparency, and it had shown the military that even the highest-ranking officers could be held accountable for their actions. The nation was no longer going to sit quietly. The fight for change had begun, and Captain Ibrahim Traoré was now at the center of it all. The moment the video of Colonel Kaboré's threat to Captain Ibrahim Traoré leaked online, the atmosphere in Burkina Faso began to shift. What had been a simmering undercurrent of discontent among the people now boiled over into full-blown public outrage. The footage of the colonel's threatening words became the spark that ignited a fire across the country. In the capital, Ouagadougou, thousands of people flooded the streets. They came from all walks of life: young students, mothers with their children, workers, and even some former soldiers. They carried flags, posters, and chanted for justice. The message was clear: Kaboré's abuse of power would not be tolerated. They stood behind Traoré, the man they now saw as a symbol of hope and honesty in a government that had long been corrupt and out of touch with the needs of its people. The protesters were not just angry about the threat to Traoré. They were angry about years of mismanagement, corruption, and a lack of accountability in the government. They wanted a change, a new direction for their country, and they saw Captain Traoré as the man who could lead them there. The video had shown that he was someone who would stand up for what was right, even if it meant going against powerful figures like Kaboré. The people believed in him now more than ever. As the protests grew larger, the streets of Ouagadougou became a battleground of ideas. Some groups marched peacefully, holding signs that demanded justice and reform. Others were more vocal, shouting their anger at the military leadership, accusing them of putting their personal power above the well-being of the people. It was clear that the country was divided. On one side were those who wanted to maintain the status quo, and on the other were those who wanted change, led by Captain Traoré. Meanwhile, the news outlets continued to broadcast the leaked footage. The story spread beyond the borders of Burkina Faso, attracting the attention of international media. The video was a clear message to the world. A high-ranking officer in the military was using his power to threaten and control a fellow officer. But what really struck a chord with people both inside and outside the country was how calmly Traoré had responded. Despite the threats, he had not backed down. Instead, he had stood tall, showing strength and courage in the face of intimidation. This made him even more popular among the masses. Back at the military base, things were not so calm. Kaboré's authority was being questioned in ways he had never anticipated. His loyal supporters tried to downplay the situation, insisting that the video had been taken out of context. But their words fell on deaf ears. The people weren't buying it. Kaboré's grip on power was slipping, and he knew it. His moves were now being watched carefully by everyone: his subordinates, the people, and the international community. The growing protests put even more pressure on Kaboré. Unable to control the situation, he ordered the military police to disperse the crowds. Armored vehicles and soldiers lined the streets, and there were clashes between the military and the protesters. Tear gas filled the air, and there were reports of a few people being injured. But the protests didn't stop. If anything, they grew more determined. The people were no longer afraid. In the midst of this chaos, Captain Traoré found himself in a difficult position. He had never asked for this kind of attention. His loyalty had always been to his soldiers and the people, not to power or politics. But now, with the entire nation watching, he knew he couldn't stand by and do nothing. He had to make a choice: remain neutral and stay out of the political fight, or step forward and lead the charge for the change that so many people had been waiting for. Traoré was no stranger to tough decisions, and this was the toughest one yet. The protests in the streets were a clear sign that the people wanted more than just reform. They wanted a new future for their country. And with Kabore losing control, the time had come for Captain Traoré to decide if he would remain a soldier or become the leader the people needed. As the streets of Ouagadougou continued to pulse with energy, the fate of Burkina Faso hung in the balance. The protests weren't just about a single military officer or a single video. They were about the future of the country, and the people knew that they had the power to shape it. The choice was now in Traoré's hands. The tension in the streets of Ouagadougou reached new heights as Captain Ibrahim Traoré faced the greatest decision of his life. The protests, sparked by the leaked video of Colonel Kabore's threats, had not only continued but had grown larger each day. People from all over the country were rallying behind Traoré, believing that he was their best hope for change. The military leadership, including Kabore, was scrambling to regain control, but their efforts seemed to fall short in the face of such widespread public support. The protests were not just in the capital anymore. Across Burkina Faso, citizens were taking to the streets, demanding justice, accountability, and an end to the corruption that had plagued their government for years. It was clear that the people were no longer afraid. They had seen the video, heard the threats, and now they were determined to hold their leaders accountable. Captain Traoré, whether he liked it or not, had become the symbol of their fight for a better future. Inside the military, the situation was becoming more complicated. Some of Traoré's fellow officers, those who had once stood with Kabore, began to question their loyalty to the colonel. Whispers spread through the ranks, and many started to see Kabore's actions for what they truly were, an attempt to maintain power at all costs. The military's unity was crumbling, and Traoré could feel the shift. It was a pivotal moment. Traoré had always prided himself on his commitment to the people of Burkina Faso. He had never sought personal glory or power, but now he had a choice: remain a soldier and let the political battle play out, or step forward and lead the charge for change. The pressure was immense. If he chose to act, there was no going back. He could become the leader the people wanted, but it would come with great risks. As the days passed, Traoré took time to reflect on everything that had led up to this moment. He thought about the soldiers who had served under him, the citizens who had marched for justice, and the future of his country. He could not ignore the fact that the people were counting on him. They saw him as someone who was willing to stand up to the powerful, someone who could challenge the status quo and bring about the change they desperately needed. After careful consideration, Traoré made his decision. He could no longer remain silent. The people needed leadership, and he was the one they looked to. He would not let them down. The time had come to take a stand, to show Kabore and the rest of the country that the power of the people could no longer be ignored. Traoré addressed his fellow officers in a speech that would go down in history. Standing before them, he spoke of unity, justice, and the responsibility they had to serve the people, not the corrupt interests of the powerful. He reminded them that they were soldiers, not pawns in a game of politics. His words were simple, but they carried weight. He was asking them to choose a side. Would they stand with the people, or would they continue to support the old broken system? As Traoré's speech spread through the ranks, something remarkable happened. Many officers who had once been loyal to Kabore began to shift their allegiance. They saw in Traoré a leader who was fighting not for personal power, but for the future of Burkina Faso. More and more soldiers began to rally to his side, and the military's divisions grew wider. Meanwhile, Kabore, trapped in his own web of lies and deceit, realized too late that he had underestimated the power of the people. The protests were no longer just a public outcry. They had become a movement, a force that could not be silenced. As Traoré gained support, the colonel's grip on power loosened. He had tried to break Traoré, but now he was facing the consequences of his own actions. The turning point had arrived. The battle for Burkina Faso's future was no longer just about one man's ambition. It was about the will of the people, and they had made their voices heard loud and clear. Now, it was time for Captain Ibrahim Traoré to lead them into the next chapter of their country's history. The days following Captain Ibrahim Traoré's speech were tense. The divide within the military was growing wider by the hour, and the pressure was mounting on Colonel Kabore. He had tried everything to maintain his grip on power. denying the leaked video, ordering crackdowns on protesters, and attempting to rally his loyal supporters. But none of it was working. The people had spoken, and now the soldiers were speaking too. The winds of change were blowing strong, and it was clear that Kaboré's time and power was coming to an end. Traoré, however, knew that things were far from over. Although he had gained the support of many soldiers and civilians, Kaboré still held significant power within the military. It would take more than words to defeat him. The country was on the brink of a full-scale confrontation, and Traoré knew that if it came to that, it would change everything forever. In the early morning hours, the tension in Ouagadougou reached its peak. The protests had been ongoing for days, and they showed no signs of slowing down. The streets were packed with people who were demanding justice, and the military presence in the city was overwhelming. Armored vehicles rumbled through the streets, and soldiers lined up at key locations, trying to maintain order, but it was clear that the people were no longer afraid. Traoré knew that the situation could no longer be ignored. The military could either stand with the people and make history, or it could remain loyal to Kaboré and risk tearing the country apart. It was a choice that would define the future of Burkina Faso. The clock was ticking, and Traoré had to act quickly. If he was going to lead the charge for change, he had to do it now. Late in the afternoon, Traoré received a message that changed everything. Colonel Kaboré had summoned him to a final meeting. It was an order, and Traoré had no choice but to obey. But he wasn't going to go unprepared. He gathered a small group of trusted officers who had pledged their loyalty to him, and together they made their way to the meeting. As they walked, the weight of the moment pressed heavily on Traoré's shoulders. This was it, the moment of truth. When he arrived at Kaboré's office, the atmosphere was cold and tense. Kaboré stood at his desk, his expression unreadable. The colonel was a man who had always been in control, but now he looked different. His confidence was fading, and there was a nervous energy in the air. He knew that his position was fragile, but he wasn't ready to give up without a fight. "Captain," Kaboré said, his voice low, "I hope you realize the position you've put yourself in. This country needs order, not chaos. You're playing a dangerous game, and it's one you won't win." Traoré didn't flinch. He had seen enough to know that Kaboré's idea of order was nothing more than control. He wasn't going to back down now. "I'm not playing a game, Colonel," Traoré replied, his voice steady. "I'm fighting for the people of Burkina Faso. They've made their choice, and so have I." Kaboré's face twisted with anger. "You're making a mistake, Captain. You don't know what you're up against. I have the support of the military, and I will not be overthrown by someone like you." "It's not just me, Colonel," Traoré responded, his eyes narrowing. "It's the people, and they're not going to stay silent anymore. They want change, and I'm going to give it to them." For a moment, there was silence. Kaboré's gaze hardened, and he stepped closer to Traoré, his voice rising. "You think you can challenge me? You think you can take my place?" "I don't want your place, Colonel," Traoré said, his tone firm. "I want to help the people. I want to see Burkina Faso thrive, not be held back by men like you." There was a long pause, and for the first time, Kaboré seemed uncertain. He knew the game was almost over. The support for Traoré was too strong, and his own power was slipping away. It was a bitter truth he couldn't deny. With a final look of contempt, Kaboré turned away. "Then it's over," he said, his voice dripping with anger. "You've made your choice." Traoré didn't respond. He knew what needed to be done. The final confrontation was over. Now it was time for him to lead. The people had spoken, and with Kaboré's defeat, the country would finally have a chance to rebuild, a chance to start anew. The day after the meeting with Colonel Kaboré, the atmosphere in Ouagadougou was different. The military, once divided, was now largely united behind Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Kaboré's authority had crumbled, and his loyalists were too few to resist the growing tide of change. The people, who had marched through the streets for days, had finally seen the results of their fight. The colonel was no longer in power, and Captain Traoré stood at the center of a new chapter for Burkina Faso. The news of Kaboré's fall spread like wildfire. Across the country, citizens rejoiced in the streets. The protests that had once been filled with uncertainty and fear were now celebrations of hope and triumph. People danced and sang, waving flags and chanting for a better future. For the first time in years, there was a sense of unity in the country, a feeling that change was not just a dream but a reality. In the capital, the military base became a symbol of the new order. Soldiers who had once followed Cabaret now stood with Traoré, ready to build a new future for their country. The change was not just political, it was cultural too. The military had always been a source of power and control, but now it was seen as a force for positive change. Traoré knew that the hard work was only beginning. The country was in need of rebuilding, and it would take more than just removing one man from power to fix what had been broken. But with the people behind him, he believed that anything was possible. As Traoré stood in front of his fellow soldiers, addressing them for the first time as the new leader, he could feel the weight of the moment. This was not about personal glory or ambition. This was about the future of Burkina Faso and the promise of a better tomorrow. Today is a new day, he told them, his voice steady but full of emotion. Together, we will work to rebuild our country. We will create a government that listens to the people, that puts the needs of our citizens first. We will not let corruption rule us again. This is our chance to make Burkina Faso stronger than ever before. The soldiers cheered, but it wasn't just the military that was listening. In the streets, citizens gathered around their radios and televisions, eager to hear from the man they had rallied behind. Traoré's words resonated with them. They knew that the change they had fought for was finally beginning to take shape. They had put their trust in him, and now he was promising to deliver on that trust. The weeks that followed were filled with both challenges and hope. The country had been through so much, and there was no easy path ahead. There were still issues to address: poverty, corruption, and rebuilding the economy. But with Traoré at the helm, the people felt like they had someone who understood their struggles and was willing to fight for a better future. Internationally, the world watched as Burkina Faso took its first steps toward recovery. Neighboring countries praised the peaceful transition of power, and leaders from around the world expressed their support for Traoré's leadership. The country, once seen as unstable, was now being viewed as an example of what could be accomplished when the will of the people prevailed. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, this was only the beginning. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready to face whatever challenges came his way. The people had chosen him, and he would not let them down. Burkina Faso had been through dark times, but now, with unity and determination, it was stepping into a brighter future. The promise of a new beginning was not just a dream, it was becoming a reality.